Good afternoon. I'm Nihal Nasruddin from East Jerusalem, and my research title is Dietary Intake of Food Assistance Recipients in Dura Neighborhood, West Bank Palestinian Authority. First of all, I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Aliza Stark, for her encouragement and great support that she has provided me, not only for this research project, but as well through the whole year of my master's. And special thanks for the Foundation Marcel A. John Coutu for their generous foundation of my master's program. Today I'm going to present the results of the survey that we have conducted to collect information and to assess the nutrition quality of two different food assistance projects that were implemented in Dura, West Bank. First of all, I would like to give you an overview of the statistics in West Bank. Approximately 16% of the Palestinian families in West Bank are food insecure. Approximately 50% of the Palestinians in West Bank as well suffer from suboptimal intake of micronutrients, and the poverty level in West Bank is 19.4%. My research study has taken place, as I mentioned, in Dura. Dura is a place in Hebron Directorate, the southern West Bank. A representative sample of females was selected from two different food assistance projects. So what are these? What is food assistance projects? Food assistance projects are interventions that address food insecurity and nutrition through different modalities. For example, either in-kind, which is a term that is called for food basket food aid, or cash transfers, for example, vouchers. In-kind is a term that is selected by humanitarian agencies and is called for any project that provides food basket for recipients or beneficiaries. It is usually designed based on the need, the culture, and the preference of a targeted population in order to meet and maintain their healthy nutritional status. Usually the food basket is developed, or the rations of the food basket is implemented based on the WHO and the FAO guidelines, which include providing 2,100 kilocalories per person per day, which of 10 to 12% from protein and around 17% from fat, and as well keen of providing exact amount of macronutrients such as vitamin A, iodine, zinc, and iron. For my study, the project that we have selected the sample from, the food basket project, they don't provide 100% of their needs based on the FAO and WHO guidelines. They provide only 60% of their needs. The food basket of the project that was implemented in Dura consists of stable foods, which is fortified wheat flour, lentils, chickpeas, fortified vegetable oil with vitamin A and D, and iodized salt. The other project that we have selected our sample from is the voucher, or the, let's say, cash transfer modality, which is the voucher project, and it provides food insecure households in West Bank with a value of $10 per person per month, which they can use to or redeem from authorized or selected shops in their area. The recipients, they have the ability to purchase nutritious and locally produced foods that include dairy products, eggs, bread, pulses, tahini, and again vegetable oil. The objective of our study is to investigate the level of the food diversity, dietary habits, and food intake among different groups of food assistance recipients in West Bank using a questionnaire that includes 24-hour recall, food consumption score that we are going to explain later, and questions regarding food preparation. The methodology that we have used, first of all, we have selected a representative sample of women using the power calculation. As I mentioned in Dura, the number of households that were targeted by the voucher were around 207 households, where our sample was around 117 individual, and the food basket project targeted in Dura around 109 individuals, and our sample was 78, based, as I mentioned, on the power calculation, 78 individual. The tool that we have used is a questionnaire that was designed and piloted several times before it was finalized, and as well translated into Arabic. This questionnaire had 4 different parts. First part is food consumption score, which tests the dietary diversity at a household level. Food preparation questions in order to collect information about the food habits. Food consumption of individuals, again to test the dietary diversity at the individual level. And the 24-hour recall to collect data on the food intake of individuals. Food consumption score, it is a tool that was designed specifically to collect data on dietary diversity, food frequency, and relative nutritional importance of different food groups who are enrolled or in food assistance projects. This information, it is selected from a specific list of 8 food groups, which include staple food, pulses, fruits, vegetables, meat and fish, milk, sugar and oil, and on the frequency of consumption in days over the last 7 days. And as I mentioned earlier, the food consumption score is usually collecting the food diversity or dietary diversity at household level, not at individual level. So eventually, what does it mean when we collect this data, or how we calculate the food consumption score? I is the food group, and A is the definitive weight that doesn't change, and X is the frequency that this food item has been eaten through the last 7 days. So for example, if we have wheat flour, so wheat flour, its definitive weight is 2. So 2 times, and for instance, we have eaten it 7 times last week. So 2 times 7 is 14, and then we sum up we do the same calculation and sum up all the 8 food groups. So at the end, we get a number, and if the food consumption score result is between 0 and 21, the profile is considered poor, which means that the diet depends mainly on high consumption of cereals, sugar, and oil, only 4 times a week vegetables, and almost no or low consumption of fruits and meats. Where when between 21.5 and 35, it is called borderline, where the vegetables are consumed around 5 times a week, meat and eggs between 3 to 4 times, and fruits only 2 times. Above than 35, which is acceptable, which means adequate food and more diversified food groups. Okay, the second part of our questionnaire, as I have explained, is the food preparation questions. We were keen to see what is the main practice that is followed by the recipients, the food assistance recipients, in preparing their food. And therefore, mainly the questions were about the consumption of oil and how many times they fry, deep frying, shallow frying, they eat outside the house or inside the house. They eat already prepared food like falafel and hummus that is prepared outside the house, etc. Food consumption of individuals, few questions were added, but it was only to know more information about the person who is interviewed, about the individual. And these questions were focusing on the amount and the number of days of consuming certain food, for example, vegetables, fruits, dairy products, and canned meat. The 24-hour recall is conducted by trained interviewers and asking the individual to recall all the food, beverages, and nutrient supplements that they have consumed during the last 24 hours. And as you all know, it take into consideration the way the food was prepared, what kind of food, different brands, etc. So our results, eventually we have targeted around 118 individuals who are enrolled in the voucher project and around 69 individuals who are enrolled in the food basket project. And regarding their diversified dietary food for individuals, we saw that the voucher beneficiaries has consumed double the quantity, or let's say the amount of milk and dairy products that were consumed by the food basket project. And this was obvious because dairy products and milk are included in the voucher project, while they are not included in the food basket. For the food voucher versus the food basket food consumption at the household level, the same results were observed, taking into consideration that mostly all the other food items were consumed the same, but fruits, although it's not included neither in the food basket or the voucher projects, but still the voucher beneficiaries had consumed. Here we are considering the days that they, how many days they have consumed fruits. It was double. And for the dairy products, the same. It was 3 days for food basket projects, whereas it was 6 days for voucher projects. This as well is influenced by the fact that the voucher project include or provide dairy products for the beneficiaries, while the food basket doesn't. When we compared the food after the calculations and we had the results of the food consumption score, we compared, and for the poor and borderline, there wasn't any significant difference, while for the acceptable food consumption score, there was a significant difference, and the number of the acceptable food consumption score among the recipients of the voucher projects were higher, and almost, as you can see, double the number of the food basket recipients. And this as well can be linked to the to the dietary diversity that the voucher project provides for the beneficiary, for their recipient, than the food basket. Regarding the eating habits, there wasn't any different. Both recipients of food basket and the vouchers project showed that they are following the same food preparing practices, and in both samples they were depending on deep frying in preparing their food, and which was a really high percentage, which almost 97% for both food basket and voucher projects recipients. As for the 24-hour recall, we didn't analyze at this stage, but it will be analyzed at a later stage, and it will help us to have more specific, more details on the specific nutrient intake and eating patterns, which will allow for calculating the actual percentage of food assistance interventions cover of the daily nutritional needs of the recipients. As a conclusion, and from the results that I have already presented, it is obvious that the voucher program is more effective than the food basket project in achieving diet diversity and giving more food options for its recipient, on the contrary of the food basket project. The limitations of our study is, of course, collecting the nutrition data is not an easy task to do. It wasn't an easy to interact with the people and to have accurate information, because it depends on their memory and their judgment and of the sizes, etc. And sometimes they were contradicting information that were provided, especially when we were asking about food preparation and the amount of vegetable oil that they are using. For instance, they say we only fry like 3 times a week, and that eventually they are using oil every day in a week. So there was contradicting information. As I mentioned, it wasn't easy to convince people to cooperate with you and to give you, let's say, personal information, because sometimes nutrition data is considered personal. So as a recommendation, based on the results that we had from our study, we recommend that there is a distinct need for developing an intensive nutrition awareness and education projects for the food assistance recipients, regardless if it's cash transfer or food transfer, in order to enhance their knowledge regarding the diet diversity, promote better usage of the food that they are provided with, and as well to help them to modify their food preparation and food eating habits. And that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Do you know the value of the basket? The vouchers are worth about $10 per person per month. Do you know how much the basket?
It is as well linked to the voucher, and it was that's why they are providing only 60%, not 100% of the WHO guidelines, in order to meet the same cost as the voucher. So more or less, it's the same.
That means a family of 5 would be getting about $50 worth of food.
Yes, yes, yes.
And just so everyone knows, it's a little bit less expensive in the West Bank than in Israel. $50, what is that, 200 shekels? It's not going to get you too much food if you're trying to feed a family.
Right.
In Rehovot, there's much more buying power in the West Bank.
I guess much better information we'll get better information when we analyze the 24-hour recall, because it shows as well. We had added another column to the 24-hour recall that shows that each item that they have eaten, what is the source of it? Is it voucher? Is it food assistance, food basket, or others? And then we will be able to say how much the food assistance covering from the daily need of each recipient, let's say, an average.
What were your personal opinions of the diversity, talking to the families and hearing about the types of food they ate? Did it seem like it was diverse to you?
Not really, because there were many elements that is affecting the food diversity. And for example, this research study has taken place, for example, in May, and where the weather started to get warmer and warmer. And the people that we have targeted are the poorest of the poor, because to be enrolled in food assistance project, you need to be in a specific category. And most of them, for example, dairy consumption has become less and less, because, for example, they don't have refrigerator to store dairy products, for example. So there are many elements, not only if they not like accessibility or availability of food, but there are many other elements that were affecting their food diversity. Another thing that even the government were providing them with money, Exactly. So this and whenever they have used, like if we interviewed them at the beginning of the month when they have received this money, they would have eaten fruits. But if it's in the middle of the month, at the end of the month, their fruit consumption would be affected. So the dietary diversity is not only linked or on food assistance projects, but it has many other elements that affected it. Yes, Salome.
Okay, I have a question with regard to the micronutrients. You mentioned that there are vulnerable groups that are given supplements, let's say the pregnant women and the children under the age of 5. So in your questionnaire, did you capture that so that it can inform your overall micronutrient status in the
As supplements wasn't part of the 2 projects that were implemented, we didn't really ask about it because we already, as I mentioned, the food basket include fortified wheat flour and fortified vegetable oil and iodized salt. So supplements wasn't really taken into consideration because, as I mentioned, it wasn't part of the projects that were implemented in that area.
But on 24-hour recall, you ask people.
Yeah.
So we'll have that data.
If they have taken any supplements, yes. But as a specific question, no. But in the 24-hour, yes.
What's the biggest obstacle you found during your interviewing people? You actually went out to all those. I'm just curious.
Yeah, actually, many. It wasn't really easy to interact with the people. Sometimes it was really even sometimes you feel like the question is really simple, but it was really hard for them to understand, to get to. As I mentioned, most of the time you depend on their memory, their judgment, and this was really hard to communicate. Let's say. What you think is not the same what they think, although you think that you are from the same culture, from the same area, etc., but it's totally different. This one was one of the obstacles, is to interact with people and to have as accurate as possible information for your survey. Any more questions?
All the piloting, which took how many times?
Yeah, it has taken more like than 3 to 4 times. We went like more than 3 to 4 times and every time we changed the questions because every time we saw that it was, this question, for example, is hard for them to answer, hard for them to remember. It doesn't make sense. The answer didn't make any sense. So we changed the questionnaire like several times until we had reached this final stage. Yeah. Any other questions?
No more questions? Then we'll, thank you very much, Neha.
Thank you.
It's one of the first ones into the project, and we have a lot of projects that's a little different. And now we're going to move on to Neely's review.
Okay, I'm Neely Siegel from the US. My mentor was Deborah Waldoff. Before I start, I'm going to start with a quote. Good food is a right, not a privilege. It brings children into a positive relationship with their health, community, and environment. And it's a quote by Alice Waters, who is an inspiration to me. She's one of the founders of the whole school garden movement in the US. So my topic is the farm-to-school approach in elementary education to improve the knowledge, attitude, and consumption of fruits and vegetables, and it's a review. So childhood obesity is a global epidemic. It's not only in the US, it's all over the world. It's been published in many journals and newspapers, and Michelle Obama in the US has gone through great lengths to make changes. And this is a comic I found really interesting, that Michelle Obama announces a strategy to combat childhood obesity in America by having ingredient labels printed on children. So this is how serious of a matter it is. So some health facts. More than 24 million children in the US are overweight or obese, which makes up over 17% of the nation's youth. And approximately 60% of the children aren't consuming whole fruits. And globally, children aren't getting the right amount of vegetables to meet their nation's requirement, like in Mexico and in Greece. And in this chart, you'll see percentages of youth aged 2 to 19 who consume vegetables on a given day. So although they consume they are consuming a lot of vegetables, but if you look at the dark green vegetables, only 11.5 of the percent of the vegetables that they're consuming are dark green leafy vegetables, which is where most of their vitamins and nutrients are coming from, because the rest are mostly starchy vegetables. So, so globally, as you can see, obesity trends are increasing in all these developed Western countries, the USA, Australia, France, and Italy. And I'm going to relate Israel to this because Israel's a developed country that tends to follow the same trends as Europe and in the USA. And from a Mabat survey also show that in Israel, obesity rates among Israeli adults are increasing. In 2001, it was 22.9%, and in 2014, it's 25.8%. So the obesity rates are increasing. And as well as the top 10 leading causes of death, what I found interesting was that in Israel, compared to Europe and the USA, diabetes is number 4 in comparison to number 8. So these health issues are all related to obesity and overweightness. So it's a topic that needs to be brought to the attention of that Israel, even though it's a small country, it follows these trends of the rest of the Western nation. So when looking at the children's obesity rates from the OECD, it's hard to see. I know it's the only graph I could get for this one, but Israel is pretty up there in obesity among boys and girls. It's above the OECD average at 20% for boys and 24% for girls. So in Israel, obesity rate is an issue for children. Some health complications from obesity, you'll have depression, you can get sleep apnea, gastrointestinal issues, type 2 diabetes, hypogonadism for boys, dyslipidemia. And although these are all complications of childhood obesity, we see them as adults also. So what's currently being done? There have been many projects in the US that started National Farm to School Network, which I'm going to be speaking about for the remainder of the presentation. It's actually the USDA now is giving grants for it, and programs such as the Edible Schoolyard, which are also based off of the Farm to School, have been implemented throughout the world, in Japan, in South America, and Australia. So every dot is different countries around the world are implementing these projects. So what is Farm to School? Farm to School is an intervention program. It's a nutrition curriculum that targets K through 12th graders. It connects children with local farmers. So it helps also the local farms. It helps also the children learn where their fruits and vegetables are coming from, where the importance of eating nutritious foods. It also helps the farmers who are suffering because a lot of these large supermarkets and fast food restaurants are taking over. So it's a win-win for both parties. Farm to School is made up of 3 components: education, procurement, and school gardens. So the education part will have they'll have kitchen classrooms where they'll have cooking demos. The children will get recipes to cook and also to bring them home to do with their families. They'll have tasting lessons. They'll have cooking demos. School gardens are also a component, so the children will be in charge of planting and harvesting their own fruits and vegetables. And the procurement portion is that any food that's given inside the schools or in the cafeterias are going to be purchased from local farms and farmers market, and they'll be organic mostly. So the objective of my review was to evaluate the effectiveness of farm-to-school intervention programs to address the current issues related to child nutrition. The methods I used were I searched different databases and keywords such as child obesity and gardens and farm-to-school. And from the review articles I selected, they all lasted a minimum of 12 weeks. The aims of the studies address the obesity prevention, healthy eating habits, and nutrition knowledge. And they covered grades 3 through 6, females and males. So from the review articles, I broke them out into 3 subcategories. The parameters were student behavior, which was comprised of a change in fruits and vegetable consumption and the change in fruits and vegetable preference. The other parameter was student knowledge and attitude, and that was measured by the impact on knowledge about nutrition, health, and food, cooking self-efficacy, and a positive attitude towards cooking. And the third parameter was a change in health outcome if there was a change in the body mass index. So for the first parameter on student behavior, there was an increase in, in fruits and vegetable consumption. In one program called Adopt a School, it was created by chefs. They created a program to teach children in a holistic manner about food, different preparation techniques for foods. They did taste and sensory sessions and how to eat together, how to set a table, and there were significant differences in the vegetable consumption for those that participated in the intervention group. This program in Texas was a really large program. It had 28 schools that participated, and this program had vegetable tastings, cooking demos, take-home recipes. They got the families to engage in lots of volunteer opportunities and also participating in school gardens. And there also was a significant difference in the vegetable consumption among students that participated. In the Cook Shop program, this program was adapted from Gimme 5, which the purpose of that was to get children to want to ask for more fruits and vegetables and to want to help their families cook and to change their eating habits. And here, the program had a cooking portion along with a food and environmental lesson, so a gardening component to it. And those that participated in both of them in combination had the least left targeted foods on their plate. So when looking at how much they used, however many left vegetable. Stumbling my words. Okay, they used plate waste technique. So they tested to see how many vegetables would be left, and fruits and vegetables and whole grains would be left on their plates. So those that participated in the program left the least amount. Nutrition in the Garden was in Idaho, and this one also had nutrition curriculum in combination with a gardening component. So it had a control school, an experimental school, which only had nutrition curriculum, and the second experimental school had nutrition along with gardening. And here we could see significant differences in the vegetable and fruit intake along with vitamin A, vitamin C, and the fiber. Fruits and vegetable preference also increased in Cooking with Kids, which was another program that had cooking lessons along with tasting lessons. And there was a significant difference in the increase in fruits and vegetable preference. In the Texas Go Eat Grow, the program I mentioned earlier, there also was a significant difference in the vegetable preference. Also in California, another nutrition program that had gardening showed significant difference in the vegetable preference. And what was interesting was that 6 months after, in the post-intervention, they still showed an increase in fruit and vegetable preference, and that was based off of questionnaires and surveys. And the Cook Shop program that I mentioned earlier also had a higher mean food preference score than those that only had nutrition curriculum. For student knowledge and attitude, there was a positive impact on the knowledge about nutrition in the Texas Go Eat Grow, the program in California, and in the Cook Shop program also showed positive impacts on the knowledge. In cooking self-efficacy, there was an increase also in the Cooking with Kids program. They showed the children who had never cooked before showed twice the gains in cooking self-efficacy once they participated in the program. And also the Adopt a School, the one where the chefs created the program, they had an increase in cooking confidence scores. And in the Cook Shop program also showed a positive impact on the self-efficacy. And lastly, Cooking with Kids also showed an improved attitude response towards cooking. Last parameter was the change in health outcomes. So 2 programs showed a decrease in the BMI. The program in Texas, what they did, they also had a physical activity portion, which was called Walk Across Texas, and they offered those challenges between all the different schools that were participating in the program, walking challenges, which also got their families involved to do it, and different types of intramural games, and a lot of gardening, because that's also considered a physical activity. And there they showed among the obese students that were in the program a decrease in the BMI from 57% to 39%. And the last program was LA Sprouts, also known as LA's Best in California. And this one was a gardening, nutrition, and cooking program for Latino youth. And here there was a 1% decrease in the BMI in the overweight population that was in the intervention group compared to a 1% increase in BMI in the control group. So as you can see, Farm to School has shown many positive effects on the health, the eating habits, the knowledge, the BMI of students, and children spend a majority of their time in the school setting. Like 2/3 of their day is at school. So it's a really great place and an ideal location and a time for children for us to influence children's eating habits and to teach them about the importance of what they're putting into their bodies and the effects it's going to have on them in their future lives. So a strategy that's been seen in many studies among infants and youth is called repeated exposure, where they're constantly giving the same vegetable or the same fruit to an infant or a child to get them to have a greater acceptance towards it. And a similar strategy can be used among children because, just because, like during gestation, a lot of the gustatory is developed in gestation. So, but after birth, also postnatal, children are still developing their taste senses. And so at an early age, like in elementary school, you can still have an opportunity to help them develop a preference towards fruits and vegetables, and for them to learn that to want to accept it and to try different fruits and vegetables and to have more variety in their diet. So it would be really good. It's a really good way to also potentially prevent future health implications, such as like diabetes and heart disease. So based off of all the reviews that I was looking at and different curriculums, I came up with some lesson plans. So this is a sample of the lessons I created. It would be over a year. So each lesson would take around a month to get through because you could have 30 to 45 minute sessions per lesson. So one lesson would be like an orientation, would be to introduce students to the kitchen, where they'll learn about the safety of the kitchen, setting the table, basic kitchen knowledge, and also how to describe their senses. And they would have a gardening component and a kitchen component. So they would have to share food memory or learn to cook from a different recipe, how to prepare the soil and plant different fruits and vegetables. Another lesson would be about seeds, learning about the seed cycle and grains and how they relate to the environment. They would have to prepare different healthy snacks based on seeds and nuts, and also start planting a vegetable. They would learn about food safety and nutrition, about the harms of pesticides and weeds, and also where nutrition, human nutrition and plant nutrition, how to harvest vegetables. And they could take field trips to grocery stores to learn how to shop, like the correct strategy for it, and how to read nutrition labels and the importance of it. So this is just a sample of some lessons that I thought would be really interesting in the program. And so in conclusion, I think that incorporating the Farm to School program in Israeli schools can be a really beneficial tool in the prevention of obesity and a lot of future health problems among these children, and they're the future of our world. So it's important, it's just as important as math and science and social studies to teach them about nutrition, and because without nutrition, we won't have any future with them. And so using lessons learned from all these existing effective intervention programs and tailoring them to meet the cultural needs of these children, it could be a really great step in the future of these children. So thank you for everyone. Any questions? Yeah?
So how's the current, what are some of the things that currently existing that preventing this to be implemented in Israel?
For Farm to School? I don't know why it hasn't been implemented yet, but there are programs in it. Like there are things in Israel being done, but not specifically combining, like that I've seen at least, because that's another thing. It was really hard for me to find what programs are already existing. There isn't much I haven't found much research here done on programs that are. I found one program that was never evaluated because funding stopped for it. There are some farms that have, there's one farm that has gardens that children can come to, but when I spoke to them, and there's no specific, they don't actually teach about nutrition. It's more like for kids to come and garden, but there's no curriculum with it. And some schools do have, they network with the kibbutzim, so the children can go to them. But like if I call schools in Tel Aviv, which I did, they didn't have. I haven't found one school that had an actual program for nutrition or like a curriculum for it. There was one school I called that that had an event. They have like a once a year, a whole like I guess like a festival or a fair for all the families to come with their children. But there's no like actual nutrition curriculum that I found that had a hands-on with cooking and gardening in combination. Because that was the whole point of this, is that having all of it combined is what I found to be effective, as opposed to only having a nutrition curriculum. Because it's one thing to teach someone to read and circle an apple that's healthy, or like look at some pictures and stories, but to actually have children garden and plant their own foods, it makes them want to they're a part of it, so they makes them want to try it and makes them more excited. They're seeing where everything's coming from start to finish.
And they do have in Rehovot, the
Yeah.
has a farm across the road.
Yeah.
That everybody in 3rd grade in Rehovot
Yeah.
does go to the farm. And they can bring 2 shekels and take home some cauliflower. But it doesn't really have a nutrition component. It has
Right.
Farming, they talk a little bit and they cook a little bit, but it's not the whole package.
Yeah.
It's more farming kind of initiative.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you, Neely, for very good presentation. And by the way, in my son's school, there was a gardening farm until this year, and then they just cancelled it. But it wasn't from the nutritional aspect. It
Right.
was from the aspect of gardening, and
Yeah.
from the aspect of maybe science, and without the nutritional outcome as measured. Okay, thank you very much. Two questions.
Okay.
Regarding the BMI, which was
Yeah.
used at 1%, okay? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
It was in LA. Yeah.
As far as I remember, okay. What were the ages of those children?
Oh, the ages were. It was in the 3rd grade, so they were around. I forgot. I just know the grades. It was in 3rd grade. Yeah. And for this, they use the bio.
It's important anyway.
Yeah.
But it's more important when BMIs.
Yeah, yeah.
It's for younger children than for
Yeah.
Okay.
But they also, in this study, they also looked at, I didn't include it in this, but in the research paper but blood pressure also they looked at the blood pressure, the waist circumference. They took all body measurements in both of the studies. And they also used the bioelectrical impedance for this.
Most of the studies, at what ages did they consider?
They're all from grades 3 to 6.
3 to 6?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And
And mostly the 3rd and 4th.
Something about Go Eat.
The Texas Go Eat Grow program in
Yeah.
BMI or the other.
But I don't remember what.
They had like the most, it could have been in this impact
Yeah.
or, sorry,
No,
the impact one?
let's see what was here. No, it's okay. It's okay. It looks good now. Again, how much children? What was the sample size?
This was 28 different schools here. I should up here.
Okay, let's just.
This is the amount of
Beginning, because I lost you
here.
with the
One.
with
It
the
had over
1,300.
1,300 3rd grade students,
Okay.
and included parents also, because this program specifically got parents to get really involved, and the community, because that's part of it also is the children. I mean, the parents are their support.
This is a large program.
Yeah, it was huge. It still exists. I mean, it's still going on. All these programs are.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions?
I had a similar question, because I was also concerned that they were looking only at BMI, so happy to hear that they also.
Yeah, they looked at, there were many parameters.
Because I'm interested in vegetable preferences and vegetable intake. I'd be curious if they would be spoke to the families. Did anyone also interview the families?
Yeah, so all of them had questionnaires and surveys that also were with their family. The parents also participated in them. Wait, you asked the question just now about, oh yeah. Other than fruits and vegetables, most of them did look at nutrients, like the program I showed you on that showed the vitamin A, vitamin C, and the fiber. So a lot of them did look at the nutrients. I just didn't show all of the graphs, but for that study specifically, it looked at that.
And also, did you see a difference in the studies between programs that were implemented in low-income?
So most of them were in pretty low, because most of them were in low-income communities. Some of them, the one in New York had half of them were African American and white Americans, and then the ones in California are mostly done on Latino youth, but they're all from pretty low-income communities.
Dina, what was considered behavioral improvement? How much more fruits and vegetables were consumed? You gave significant, but you didn't say numbers. What is considered success?
Oh, because it was based off of, they scored different, they had surveys, so it was based off of scoring. So it was based off of questions that they asked children. Is that what are you asking?
Did they ask how many fruits and vegetables did they
Oh,
eat?
yeah, it would be like it would be like based on like okay, some of them had food frequency questionnaires, so they can look at how many times a week or a day they're eating fruits and vegetables, or if they asked at home, like what they were eating at home, or what they brought to school, or if they liked a fruit, like they would be given a list of vegetables. One study actually had them, they had a list of vegetables that they used in also the tasting lessons, and they had them do a pre and post test. So they rated their likeness, how much they liked certain vegetables. Actually, carrots were always the most liked vegetable. Carrots and zucchini and jicama were the most liked vegetables in all of the surveys for some reason. Pre and post tests.
But that just means they like it. That doesn't mean they're eating it.
No, but then I know. But I'm trying to just show different like ways that they assess like all the different parameters, because all of them had questionnaires and surveys. But yeah, for liking it and eating it, they were all based on questionnaires.
Just for when they do a meta-analysis, when they see an increase of about half a serving a day,
Yeah.
that's huge success. And you can say that's not very much. But when you're only eating 2 or 3 servings a day, half a serving a day increase, and every week there's 2 or 3 more vegetables a week. Little by little, but the numbers aren't, they went from eating no vegetables to eating a whole half their plate vegetables. That, we don't see so much. Small increments that are better than before maybe, but not necessarily so impressive that they're eating.
Yeah, like there was one study that showed that that their vegetable intake did increase, but it still didn't meet the diet. It didn't meet the regulation. Yeah, but it was still an increase, and it was significant from what they were doing before. So it's still an improvement.
And that's
So
over
from
12 weeks.
Yeah.
Bad to less bad, something like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Also, I was thinking one of the things in Israel that I think could prevent a program like this from being implemented is that the school day is very short here. Kids get out at 12:45 or 1:30.
So some of them do, because I found there are some that have after-school programs though, and some of these programs, one of the programs is an after-school program, because I mean a lot of parents are still working later in the day, so it's a really good opportunity also if a child's not participating in sports or another after-school to have this as an option to participate in the program. I'm sure many of them would love doing it, or parents would like getting their kids to do it.
Or even on a community level.
Yeah.
Something like this in a neighborhood. They do things like this in low-income neighborhoods in New York and Harlem.
Yeah, well, Cook Shop is huge, and it's all over, and like they have a lot of community gardens. So I know like in certain parts of Israel it does exist, but in the big cities it really doesn't. And if there is like a problem because of there's no like garden in the school, or there's spaces limited because it's a city school, there are also options to go to a park in the cities, or to also have in school, like you can grow vegetables. I mean, I grow vegetables inside my apartment. I grow peppers. So like you can grow things inside school also. You just have to change the curriculum to be based on what's available and what the resources are in the school. If there's no kitchen, you don't need a kitchen. You can do salads, and you can do like raw cooking. So yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Tendai Tambala, and I'm from Malawi. I'll be presenting on a topic called Strategies for Feeding and Supplying Nutritional Requirements in HIV-infected as well as exposed children in Africa. And these children are from the ages 6 to 59 months. But before I start the presentation, I would like to thank Peers Foundation for the financial support that allowed me to complete my studies here at the Hebrew University. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Anna for accepting me as a student to mentor. And let me say that I had a very good experience working with you. And thanks for the help that that was provided whenever I needed it. So, as an introduction, UNICEF has defined undernutrition as outcome of insufficient food intake as well as disease. So this condition results in so many outcomes. Most of them are chronic as well as acute. So on the acute outcomes of undernutrition, we have like underweight, wasting, as well as micronutrient deficiencies. And thank you. And on the chronic outcomes, we have like stunting as well as mental impairment. So globally, the prevalence of undernutrition is still high in sub-Saharan African countries as well as in Asia, as you can see from the picture. The blue color that we're seeing is the dark blue color actually is the prevalence of undernutrition in which is like over 40% of the population. So it's very high, like I said, in the sub-Saharan Africa as well as in Asia. And these results are very recent results, like last year. So we can see that it's still a problem in most developing countries like Africa. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with the conceptual framework of undernutrition in children. So there's so many causes of undernutrition, and basically we have three classes or three categories. We have immediate causes, underlying causes, as well as basic causes. So in this particular study, we'll be focusing on immediate causes, especially disease, not dietary intake. So before I go any further, I'd mentioned earlier on that we'll be focusing on a disease. So this particular disease is HIV. So HIV has been, we all know that it causes AIDS with time. And this happened through different stages. However, I would like to share with you, to tell you, in case you didn't know, that there have been so many theories that have been developed in order to explain how HIV and AIDS affect the immunity. So one particular theory is called CD4 apoptosis. So in this diagram that you're seeing, normally the thymus, which is found in the glands, produces CD4 cells, which are a form of T cells, which are part of the adaptive immune system. So normally these cells, we usually have cell apoptosis in each and every cell because we can't just have cells multiplying without cell death. So these cells also undergo a similar trend. They go through apoptosis. But as you can see from this diagram here, the apoptosis is not very high, so that our immunity is maintained. We don't want to lose all of it. However, when when a person is infected with HIV and AIDS, the efficiency of the thymus to produce the CD4 T cells decreases, as shown by a smaller number of T cells being produced compared to the normal ones. And the pool of CD4 cells also reduces because of the virus. And not just that, the infected CD4 cells, they in turn make other cells, initiate cell death in other nearby cells, which are good for promoting the immunity of the person. So basically from this graph, we can see that HIV infection decreases the immunity, and this is just one part of it. There's so many theories that have tried to explain this type of decrease in immunity. So like I said, AIDS doesn't just doesn't just develop, it takes several stages. And as you can see from this graph, firstly we have like initial infection. This happens like 2 to 6 weeks after being infected. And this stage is usually identified, you cannot actually know because the signs are mild and they include signs like flu, which is like normal, like any person can get flu, so you can't actually tell. But then as the disease progresses, as more cells in the body are being infected, you might have like symptoms being shown. And then with time, you develop you develop AIDS, which is a combination of different diseases, and this further lowers the immune system. So another aspect that I would like to explain is the cycle of undernutrition as well as HIV and AIDS. So normally when a person is undernourished, which is categorized as poor nutrition, there are so many results that I mentioned earlier on, like weight loss, as well as nutrient deficiencies. And these results in turn impair the immune system by impairing the immune system, and this further decreases the ability of the immune system to fight against infection, and also decreased immune system and impaired immune system leads to increased oxidative stress in the body, and this also increases the vulnerability of the person to so many infections. As a result, the nutritional needs of the person increases, and an increased nutrition, if they're not met, then they lead to poor nutrition, and the cycle goes on. So HIV and AIDS can affect the cycle on either of these 4 different stages. So HIV and AIDS worsens the condition further. It worsens the condition, all of the conditions that I mentioned earlier on, so they become worse, and as a result, the person's nutrition keeps on deteriorating. So now let's look at feeding practices in HIV-exposed children. So the feeding practices that have been recommended by so many organizations, including WHO, have evolved throughout time. Initially, after discovering HIV and AIDS in breast milk in 1985, it was recommended that all mothers should stop breastfeeding. Instead, they should formula feed their infants. But this had a number of negative effects because most mothers cannot afford formula milk, especially in Africa. So they ended up diluting the formula milk, which later on affected the nutrition status of the children. And further, due to hygienic conditions, like maybe they're using water which is not safe, so the children started having like diarrhea as well as respiratory infections. As a result, the recommendations were further revised, and then in 2007, it was encouraged that mothers who cannot afford formula feeding should continue to breastfeed their children exclusively for 6 months and continue to do so at least for 12 months. And that set a criteria for those who could afford formula feeding. For example, they had to formula feed when the conditions were acceptable in their communities, if the conditions were feasible, as well as affordable and safe. So those who met this criteria were encouraged to formula feed. However, the encouragement of formula feeding led to mixed feeding, where the mother would at times have formula and sometimes not. So she would like mix the two, sometimes breastfeed, sometimes not. And also she could also like give the child other types of food products like water and other liquid and semi-liquid products. So this in turn also resulted in increased risk of HIV infection among the children. So as a result, the recommendations were also revised in 2010. it was recommended that every mother who is pregnant, they should take ARVs. We heard about it in the morning by Mildred. So a combination of ARVs amongst the mothers, as well as continued breastfeeding for 6 months exclusively, as well as continued breastfeeding after 6 months until 12 months. So these are the current recommendations. So in this study, research articles were searched from PubMed as well as Google Scholar, and there were a number of factors that were considered in order to select these articles. And one of the main factors to consider was randomized control studies or prospective cohort studies, and all studies that were published in 2006 as well as to 2016. And all these studies were from Africa among children that were exposed to HIV or infected by HIV, but they had to be from 6 to 59 months. So inclusion criteria included all these, all cross-sectional studies and nutrition interventions before 6 months of age, like from during pregnancy until six months of age, they were excluded. And studies focusing on breastfeeding only, they were also excluded. And studies that were focusing on drug interventions and not nutrition interventions, they're also excluded. So keywords and phrases such as infant feeding and nutrition interventions were used in order to come up with a number of relevant articles. And in total, the study found like 16 studies, and they were used for analysis for this paper. So now let's look at the interventions for preventing undernutrition as well as mother-to-child transmission among HIV children. So these, the following studies that I'm going to present are basically going to be about prevention of malnutrition as well as mother-to-child transmission, but in children that are aged 6 to 59 months. So one of the main intervention that was good and very successful was nutrition counseling on infant feeding practices. So this intervention has been found to work as a standalone intervention, as well as an intervention that's incorporated in other interventions. So here with me, I have an example of a study that was done by Sodar, and this study had 2 groups. In total, they had like 103 children that were HIV infected, as well as those that did not know their HIV status. So those that did not know their HIV status and were not willing to learn about it, they were grouped in the PMDC group, which is the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV and AIDS. So those that were in the group of PMDC were provided with regular counseling and regular counseling. So as a result, those that were advised, those that knew the HIV status and were advised about it, and they were advised, counseled on infant feeding, they had opted for infant formula because they could firstly access it and afford it. And those that did not receive the intervention practiced mixed feeding, which has been known to increase HIV risk among children. And as a result, in total, out of the 59 children that were enrolled in the intervention group, only 31 of them got HIV infected, and 44 out of all the children from this group, they ended up being infected. However, this was not significant. The infection, it was not significant. But it's a good study because it shows us that when a mother is counseled on infant feeding, then she can be able to make informed choices that can help her to prevent transmission of HIV to her child. So the second intervention that we looked at was heat treatment of breast milk. So this particular intervention actually aims at reducing HIV load in the breast milk. This is done by lightly heating the breast milk. Firstly, the mother has to express the breast milk, and then she has to lightly heat it in order to reduce HIV load. And one study that was done in Malawi, it found that there was no decline in either weight or linear growth compared to the time the children were recruited into the study. And out of the 20, it wasn't a very big study, but it has meaningful implications. One out of the 20 infants that were enrolled in the program was found to be HIV positive. But this is, okay, let's just look at the other study that was done by Caroline. This study concluded that there was no treatment, there were fewer trend towards fewer ear infection in those that were receiving the heat treatment intervention. And this was significant in this particular study. And growth among those that were getting the intervention and those that were not was also not significant. So these results actually tell us that heat treatment of breast milk can be it can be an intervention that can be promoted amongst women from rural communities that cannot afford formula feeding. So because they're not just protecting the children from HIV infection, but they're also giving the children the needed nutrition for growth as well as development. So another intervention, actually food-based interventions. So there were a number of them, but I selected to present two. So the first one we see is called a lipid-based nutrient supplement, and this is how it looks like. So this study showed that there was significant improvement in anthropometric measurements as well as overall nutrition status of the children. And in this particular study, adherence to the intervention was very high, reported as high as 94.1%. And in another study where they were given a Vitamil, which is basically a brand of soy as well as maize, and it's fortified with micronutrients, it found that anthropometric scores also significantly improved, and diarrhea rates were very low. However, the only limitation I found with these two studies is that they did not have a comparison group. So instead, the study was conducted in 2010, for example, and this one is in 2013. But all the results that they got, they compared them to the Malawi demographic study, which took place like 6 years before. So I think it would have been better if these two studies had a control group, and so that we could derive meaningful conclusions out of the studies. Another study that was interesting was multivitamin supplementation. So in a study that was done by Tungan, it concluded that there was no treatment effect on stunting, wasting, underweight, hospitalization as well as unscheduled clinic visits. Reports of diarrhea were also not significant in children that received the intervention compared to those that did not receive. So another study also showed that multivitamin supplementation have no effect on growth among HIV-exposed children. So before I go further, let me just say that these two studies were implemented on the hypothesis that multivitamin supplementation, especially vitamin C as well as vitamin E, they help in reducing oxidative stress. So we know that oxidative stress increases multiplication of vitamin A. So the aim was to reduce the multiplication of HIV in the children. But like we've seen, it wasn't very successful. So one of the study that I presented earlier on, it was a very large sampled study, and the results showed that those that got the micronutrient supplementation, they had more children dying like high mortality rate compared to those that did not get the supplementation. So this is interesting to further research about it, because it wasn't indicated why there were children were dying in those children that received the intervention compared to those that did not. So our second objective was to look at feeding interventions that aim at treating undernutrition as well as among HIV infected and exposed children. So in the previous presentations, it was about preventing undernutrition as well as HIV transmission from the mother to the child. So in this particular section, we'll be presenting on interventions that are aimed at treating undernutrition and not preventing. So we have basically two interventions that were found to be effective in treating child undernutrition. One of them is the use of usually called plumpy nuts or ready-to-use therapeutic food. So this is how it looks like. It's in a packet, and normally it provides like 500 kilocalories per gram per kg. So, but then in this particular studies, they used the kind of plumpy nuts that had 200 kilocalories. So a study done by those two in Malawi, they found that nutritional recovery varied depending on the HIV status of the child, but overall the nutrition status had improved. And another intervention was soy brand. So this particular food had improved in nutrition status of children, and the rate was high, up to 82.6% for moderate acute malnutrition, as well as 73.5% for severe acute malnutrition. So in conclusion, we've seen that interventions for preventing HIV transmission as well as undernutrition can actually be grouped into four, the ones that we've looked at. We've looked at counseling, we've looked at heat treatment of breast milk, and we've also looked at food-based nutrient supplements. So these three have been found to work, and they're very effective in either preventing as well as treating undernutrition. However, we have seen that micronutrient supplementation, especially when vitamin C and vitamin E are a big part of it, did not improve the nutrition status of the children. And also, not only did it not improve, but there were also a number of deaths in those people who received the intervention. And for interventions that we looked at for treating undernutrition, we've seen that ready-to-use therapeutic food was effective, as well as supplementary programs such as soy brand. However, I should say that the interventions that are food-based, usually they're not sustainable, because you can't continue to provide women with food supplements. Instead, it would be better if all these programs were accompanied with counseling, like food diversity counseling, as well as other kinds of counseling that can make them to continue using foods that have a similar importance as the intervention. Last but not least, from this review, we found that appropriate ART, antiretroviral therapy regimes, amongst mothers that were HIV infected, regular medical checkups, as well as continued counseling, and are very crucial for the success of each and every intervention. And let me just say that, like I said earlier on, counseling is more effective because firstly it's sustainable. once you give mothers the knowledge, they'll never forget it. So it's sustainable, and it's cost effective. So of all this intervention, counseling should be the number one intervention, and not just a standalone intervention, but it should be incorporated in a number of interventions. Like I said earlier on, food-based interventions were also successful, but these, we have to know that they're not sustainable, so we should come up with options for making sure that the intervention is sustainable. However, this review cannot make any recommendations as regards to multivitamin interventions because we saw earlier on that they were not effective. However, it would be so interesting for future research to look at the immune response of multivitamin supplementation in HIV infected children, because we would like to know like what goes wrong in the body when such vitamins are given to HIV infected children. And lastly but not least, it would be interesting to examine the effects of individual vitamin supplement. In this case, say the effects of giving vitamin C or vitamin E alone, and see what response can be got from that. So I would once again want to thank Peers Foundation for the financial support lended, the Hebrew University staff members, Aliza for the support, and most of all Anna for mentoring me throughout and for giving me the help I needed whenever I needed it. And lastly, I'd like to thank my fellow students for the cooperation, support, and everything. And particularly, I'd like to thank Pearl. She's been more than a sister to me, and thank you for that. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for a few short questions. Zendaya, you need to tell whose turn this is to ask.
Okay.
Questions.
Okay. Teresa?
Thank you for your nice presentation. It's informative, helpful for back-home research. And I would like to ask you a question with regard to heat treatment of breast milk. I really very much concerned about the African women living in rural settings, which are as far as their delicacy is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hygienic condition. Everything is very much challenging in the rural areas of the African setting. So how it is feasible in order to implement heating of breast milk can be as an intervention to prevent HIV transmission?
The two studies that I presented earlier on, they were done in rural communities in Zimbabwe as well as in Zambia. So they tried it in the rural communities and it was successful. And the component that made it more successful was the counseling part, because they're meeting the professionals, like they were visiting their homes regularly, and sometimes they had like to stay there in order to make sure that the procedures that they were taught were being followed. And with time, women were doing it easily, and it wasn't a problem at all. So it's a matter of just counseling, not it can be possible. As regards to water safety, I think you can, okay, in this particular case, for example, women were encouraged to firstly boil the water, like before they use it, so that it's safe for those that do not have clean water. So I feel like it's not a problem in an African setting. It was done in an African poor setting, so it's possible.
Energy is also another problem, and they don't know how many degrees centigrade the milk should be boiled. If they boil extremely, it will be the protein will be denatured and no nutritional content will be exist in the milk.
True.
So in this case, it's quite difficult to intervene such intervention.
Well, during the training program, like the procedures, or one thing that they provided was like a thermometer. And actually, women know about temperature. When you tell them, they know. Like in most African countries, we don't use. Okay, in this particular study, like in the very first days, they were using a thermometer. But then with time, women got used to it. They could tell that, okay, this is the right heat. And basically, that's what we use. That's what we do in African settings. We don't use thermometers, but instead, we know that this is lukewarm. And those that, for example, those like Salome, you have a child, right? And you've ever given formula, right?
Yeah.
Were you using like thermometers in order to measure the temperature? No. So women know about these things eventually. Yes.
Something on the same. In the morning, we saw that there are even more, according to the current recommendation, which are much better. Like, can we just provide the drugs and we allow women to breastfeed instead of torturing women to expressing the milk and then it's treating and all that? Can we just, in your opinion, can we just adopt the current recommendation that have been done by WHO?
Well, according to the findings, yes, we can do both actually, because these particular two studies, the ones I presented on heat treatment, we said that the results were so significant. The viral load had decreased. In the option B plus, the viral load is still there, but we don't want it. We want to decrease it a little bit. So this particular intervention will actually make the option B plus more effective than just leaving it there, in my opinion.
Anna, do you want to ask anything?
Yes, I think that the first study that you presented, can you just go to the slide?
The one on counseling?
Very first, yeah.
Okay.
Very first study.
Uh,
To there.
this one.
The 44 infants in the non-PMTCT cohort versus 31, wasn't it a baseline? Because you presented it as, I understood, as a result of the intervention, but was it a result? Wasn't it a baseline?
No, it was a result of an.
It was a result, one of the results?
Yeah, the one.
Remember those results? I thought that this was a baseline. Okay, thank you. So I just want to say that in Tandai's work, I just really thought very different from our point of view, very different issues, really. As a Western woman, okay, I just didn't understand until this work of Tandai how different this world is. Okay, it's very different.
Thank you.
I have a question, but maybe a follow one second. But when they gave micronutrient supplements, and we have the same thing, when we give iron supplements for anemia, we don't have good results. And why do you think that micronutrient supplements really did not help?
Honestly, I don't think I have the expertise to explain that. I think it's more
I'm sure
at.
In the conclusion to the article, they discussed it.
No, they didn't.
They just said that there was no impact, and that was it.
There was no impact. Yes, that was it. And I feel like it's more of biochemical. Like it has to do with the biochemistry of our bodies, but not.
Does anyone have a suggestion or an idea?
Perhaps.
Why when we give supplementations of micronutrients, we're not seeing better nutrition in infants which are HIV positive or?
HIV positive, and specifically those that were from 6 months to 5 years. There's that.
Did anyone have an educated guess?
Just want to be sure. I think because micronutrients like iron are food for microorganisms like bacteria and
viruses? more worms because they're in better nutritional state, the worms do better. And then we don't see any improvement because we've given supplemental iron because we're helping the pathogens. And maybe one of the reasons why micronutrients weren't so effective in improving the situation is because they're also feeding the pathogen.
I also have guessed that before we improve the macronutrients, we have nothing to do with micronutrients because the basis of all the health is the energy and protein, and without those components, I don't think that we have a great chance to change something to a good direction because they're stunted, they are undernourished, they are ill, okay, they are sick. So all the micronutrients in those situations, we don't see a lot of success in any child or grown up. First of all, energy and proteins.
Okay, thank you very much, Sundai. Let's move on to our next talk. I think Mary? Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Mary, and I'm going to present a review on historical changes on trans fatty acids. I'm going to look at public health and industry perspective, specifically in the USA, although I will give background information on other areas. My mentor is Professor Efrat, and I thank her so much for the support that she has given me. This is a totally gray area for me, and she has given me all the support. I would also like to thank Pears Foundation for the scholarship that has enabled me to be in this prestigious university. So to start us off, we know that fats are a very essential component of our diet. We cannot do without them. At the same time, fats are also very dangerous, especially what we call the bad fat in our diets. They predispose us to increased inflammation, cardiovascular diseases, insulin resistance, as we have seen from morning. They also interfere with the microbial biota. So let's see which kind of fats that we are going to be talking about. So in the year 2003, progression started in the USA to have all the foods labeled. How much trans fats do they have? And why was it necessary to label trans fats? That's what we are going to look at. And what are trans fats? I'm sure we all remember our biochemistry very well. But they are basically the trans isomers in the fatty acids. You can have a very good fatty acid like oleic acid, which is quite common in olive oil. When you process or you hydrogenate oleic acid, you end up with allylic acid, which is a trans isomer of the oleic acid. And now you move from the good one to the bad one, what we call the bad fat. So they occur naturally, and they also occur artificially. The natural ones are like the vasenic acid, which is found in meats and also in milk. So that one is naturally occurring. There isn't much the industries can do about it. So it also occurs in both the cis and the trans. The cis one is uric acid, which is basically omega-9. And then vasenic acid is the trans. So, and they can also be monosaturated, meaning one double bond, polyunsaturated, double bonds. So why do we worry about trans fatty acids? Many researches have been done. I will only cite one by Lopez that was done in the year 2005. It's concluded that trans fatty acids a major risk factor for metabolic syndrome, including the cardiovascular, which is the leading cause of morbidity and mortality in most Western countries, and now the developing countries are catching up. Insulin resistance and obesity, which is accompanied by systemic inflammation. And we'll see why trans fatty acids cause systemic inflammation. So what are the mechanisms? I look at the first mechanism. The trans fatty acids influence prostaglandin balance in the body. And how do they do that? They interfere with the elongation of the omega-6 or the 6 desaturates to 5 desaturates, and more specifically, conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid. I hope I pronounce it well. As well as other polyunsaturated fats. So when that happens, what comes around in our system is that we get imbalances in the fatty acid, and that leads to changes in phospholipid fatty acid composition, specifically in the aorta. So when that happens in the aorta, then we are predisposed to cardiovascular diseases. And when this happens, again, we end up with more low-density lipoprotein than the high-density lipoprotein, because we need the continuity of the breakdown or the metabolism, so that we end up with high-density lipoproteins. And we know the high-density lipoproteins are the ones that carry the low-density lipoproteins from the peripheries back to the liver. So if that we have lower levels of high-density lipoproteins, we'll end up with accumulation of what we call the plaque in the aorta. And why this fatty acid is quite important is because it's one of very key fatty acids in the inflammation intermediate, and also a vasodilator, and also very key in signaling. So when we don't have this fatty acid, then it means that we are going to have a lot of inflammation in the system. And to explain that, there's a study that was done that fed mice on a diet rich in trans fatty acids. So when you look at the first, the A end, I can see from this.
There's a pointer on the table if you want, Mary.
Oh yeah, thank you. So this was the heart valve before in the normal diet, and this is the aorta, the condition of the aorta in the normal diet. So when you compare this to this is after the rats were fed on, or the mice were fed on a diet that is rich in fatty acids for only 24 weeks. Look at the changes in the heart valve and also in the aorta. There was a lot of accumulation of the foam cells and fibro-intimal proliferation. And when this happens, of course, you expect now vasoconstriction and predisposition to cardiovascular and also increased inflammation. So trans fatty acids, again, they activate systemic inflammation responses, as we have seen. And this is another study that involved 19 subjects. It was a crossover, double-blind study. So the subjects were distributed in the diets randomly. It went on for 32 days. So at the end of it all, we can see there was production of interleukin 6 or IL-6, which is a marker of inflammation, and also TNF-alpha. They were significantly higher in this kind of diet. So all these subjects, anytime they landed on this diet, there was increased inflammation. So that basically means that trans fatty acids have a role to play in increased inflammation. So my aims and objectives was to summarize the existing body of research on the historical changes in trans fatty acids. I look at the industrial and public health perspective.
objectives, I was looking at a historical background of how did we come up with artificial trans fatty acids. I'm not going to look at the natural ones because there's nothing that we can do about them. So the artificial ones, how did we come up with them? The public health policies about trans fatty acids, and also trends in the US before and after the policy changes to see whether we are getting anywhere. And to do this, I did, I searched for articles, journals, books that had the required, the terms, trans fatty acids, all those. And then I looked at the studies that were done in the 19th century. I'm the only person who is allowed to be historical, and 20th century. So if a study was done in 1801, I have it. So basically, in a normal diet, Western diet, this is the consumption. 79% of the trans fatty acids are the artificial trans fatty acids. 21% is the natural one. And we have looked at the natural one, the arsenic acid, and there's also the conjugated linoleic acid. About the natural ones, not a lot of studies have shown their negative health, impacts on health. So there are no recommendations on their reduction. They just say take lean meat, but not many studies will show us the health impact. It's actually, the studies I've seen, some say that conjugated linoleic acid is very useful, especially for when someone exercises, because it reduces the levels of inflammation, and it's also good for, it's known to be like anti-carcinogenic, but studies are still ongoing. And then most of the artificial trans fatty acids are from shortenings and margarine. So how did hydrogenation start? Because it's the one that brought all the artificial trans fatty acids. It started in 1890s by somebody called Paul Sabatier. He's the one who started, who discovered the process of hydrogenation, but he was only doing it on hydrogenated vapors. He didn't introduce it in fats. And because these were I think this was the First World War, or it was the period during the war. We had a shortage of, the world had a shortage of the butter, and also the unsaturated fats. Because of what was happening, especially the unsaturated fats, the glycerol was being used to produce some weapons. So it was limited, the use was limited. So it was a blessing for Will Norman to have discovered that you can actually do hydrogenation on liquid oils and get a solid fat. And so the process began, and he actually acquired the rights to use. And after that, the rest is history. Procter and Gamble, actually, they also joined in and moved it further. And in the USA, Crisco is a very common shortening, and it was the first shortening that was introduced in the USA, and it was the first ones were made from cotton seeds. But later on, soybean was imported a lot in the USA to be used for proteins, and a lot of soybean oil started being used. So much later, in the 60s, most of the shortening and also the margarine was from soybean. And of course, in the 60s, there was plenty of rolling over. And of course, you can't just sell. The manufacturers had to link up with public health policy makers, advocates, to show how good is partially hydrogenated oils. And that really helped to move it and, of course, get people from using butter. And this is what happened, we can see. In the 1950s and 59, more people were taking butter compared to margarine. This was the daily consumption. Then it went, in the 60s, 69, margarine took over, and the rest is history. But of course, as we move to the 2000, we can see the levels have started coming down. And that is the time we had a lot of campaign against saturated fatty acids, so consumption decreased. Sorry. And we can see deaths in cardiovascular, the change. No, in the 60s, very few. Around 60s, you can see the levels. And of course, as we approach towards from the year 2000s, when you know a lot of campaign also against saturated fatty acids, the deaths started to come down. But we cannot say it's just because of the consumption. Of course, healthcare also improved and awareness. So why was it so easy to sell the hydrogenation process? It's because the products that were made through hydrogenation process were more stable. If you compare shortening to something like olive oil is prone to rancidity because of oxidation unless it has vitamin E in it to prevent and also storage. But shortenings can be stored in any, and they are very stable. They can stay for longer, so it was much easy to sell. They also have improved the texture. Compare margarine to butter. Which one has a better texture? They are very precise and suitable for various end products and palatability, very palatable. And it was also easier to buy shortening as compared to something like canola oil or olive oil, the unsaturated fats. The cost for especially the saturated fats was really, really down. And also butter, margarine, you know, the costs are different. Then there was also the belief that unsaturated trans fats, like in margarine, were healthier than saturated ones in butter, because butter has saturated, margarine has unsaturated. So a lot of studies were funded by the industries, and of course they sold the margarine. So who else? You know, there's always has to be drumming around for sales to go on. There's a guy called Phil Sokoff in the USA. He's a very serious advocate. So in the 1980s, he actually advocated for switch of use of beef tallow, which is saturated fat from cows, you know, fat from cow. That McDonald's was using that in French fries. So they were actually told to switch. And that was supported by the public health policy makers. And there was almost like an overnight switch. So they switched from use of beef tallow to use of shortenings. And also in 1984, Center for, let me get the, it's called the Center for Science in the Public Interest. They also advocated for the switch from saturated fatty acids to partially hydrogenated oils. And of course, that stand changed in 1992 because of the studies. In 1990s, however, there were studies that re-emerged to show that trans fatty acids were not healthy. And in 1994, it was estimated that mortality in the USA due to trans fatty acid was as high as 20,000 persons per year. So, of course, this forced the policymakers to rethink. And when they rethought, in January 2006, the FDA began the process of labeling policy, and trans fatty acids were to be listed under saturated fats. If you look at the current labels, you will see that. And the evidence that was used to support that is that labeling would prevent between 600 and 1,200 cases of cardiovascular diseases in the US, quite a big deal. And also to aid in the labeling, trans fatty acids were defined as a sum of all unsaturated fats that contain one or more isolated double bonds in trans configuration. Then, before, in the 80s, what was happening as far as policy was concerned? In the 80s, there were dietary guidelines began in the USA. under the supervision of USDA and USDHHS. And the guidelines provide authoritative advice for population 2 years and above. And what they say is they give the importance of good dietary habits in promoting good health and reducing major chronic diseases. So let's see. In the 80s, we still had cases that trans fatty acids are bad, but what did they advise the people to do? 1980, 85, 90 dietary guidelines. They only talked about reduction of intake of total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol in the diet. I'm sure we all remember that. In 1995, the story was still the same. In 2000, but here there was something they called it. Contain a particular form of unsaturated fat known as trans fatty acid that may raise blood, may. That means there was no convincing evidence. In 2000, Americans were urged to choose a diet that is low in saturated fatty acids and cholesterol and moderate in total fat. So trans fatty acids, there was nothing. It was quite silent. So progression towards the ban in 2003, that is when the rule on labeling was started, and it was passed in 2006. 2005, the guidelines that were given is that the fat should be, saturated fats should be less than 10% of the diet in a day. Cholesterol per day, 300 milligrams, less than 300 milligrams. Trans fats, keep them as low as possible. In 2013, trans fatty acids, judgment began to see whether are they useful. Should we retain them? Should we give any guideline as far how much people should take in a day? So that was that preliminary judgment started to see whether they are GRAS or they are generally recognized as safe. So based on that, it was actually shown that they are not safe, and 2018 they should be removed from, all the artificial trans fatty acids should be removed from food commodities in the USA. What are some of the technological issues that the industries are looking at to reduce trans fatty acids? Instead of hydrogenation, there is interesterification. And what this does is that it rearranges. Take if it's olive oil, if you want to make something that is semi-solid, it rearranges, uses the same, and then a command is given in the computer to rearrange the same fatty acids in the glycerol bonds, to rearrange them, not changing. It doesn't change the mother. And the types that are being used, there is acidolysis. These are like the chemical reactions that they use. There is alcoholysis and transesterification. Transesterification is the most common one. So the approaches to interesterification, we have the random, the direct, and the enzymatic. I will not go into their details. There is also fractioning and blending that is being done to come up with oils that are, or fats that are healthier. The other ways is that food industries have to switch from using shortenings or partially hydrogenated oils to using unsaturated fatty acids in frying. Public has also been urged to use natural oils like canola, and also reading of the labels to ensure that consumption of foods that are, or purchase of foods is based on 0% trans fatty. So have we seen any changes? Before the 2006, studies that were done before 2006 show that consumption of trans fatty acid in a typical diet was forming up to 2.6% of the total fatty acids taken. So it was quite high. All these studies have similar, if you look at just the mean. So the mean intake was quite high. So after this one is just on the same, like what the means were translating to grams per day, like 4.5, 5.2 grams per day of trans fatty acids. So after the 2006 reformulations, we can see, if we look at these are commodities that this was done between 2006 and 2009. They were looking at the commodities to look at the trans fatty acid levels. So in 2006, you can see the levels are coming down, 2007, 2000. So they are all coming down. If we look at all these graphs, let's not think of what they are telling us. Let's just look at the trends. We can see the trends are towards 0, or at least there is a significant reduction. So basically what we can say is that a lot of progress has been made in the US to limit intake of partially hydrogenated oils, and industries are committed. Policymakers are also considering evidence in decision making, and there is multi-sectoral approach, as we have seen. So, and in conclusion, we have notable gains, and these gains can further be actualized if manufacturers continue to reduce the amounts, as we have seen in the commodities. And frequent, if possible, annual monitoring will be required, especially after 2018, to see whether the commodities have 0 trans fatty acid. And these are the nutrition fact labels. You can see before 2006, this is how they looked like. There was no trans fatty. If you look at the current labels, you will see trans fatty acids. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If people have, it's a different kind of talk. Every talk is a little different.
Yes.
You said that most of the people consumed trans fatty acid was something like 2 point something %?
Yes.
So
of the total
so
fat.
much, yeah.
Of the total fat. So it was
20.55 of
total fat,
total
yeah.
calories.
Yes, like if you look at this, like 2.5 is actually 2.6, for example, is equivalent to 6.2 grams of trans fatty acid intake per day. So that is quite high. If you look at the translation into what percent, based on a 30% intake. So for people
30%
intake of fat, yes,
in calories. It's
in
only
calories, only in calories.
So 2.6 is not so much. It's not so much. I would think it would be more. Maybe because it's the mean, and with the populations that didn't consume it all. But we say it is hazardous if it's above 2%. So it's above.
It's above 2%, yes. It is above 2% because it's 2.6. Yes.
It's based on food frequency questionnaires.
Yes.
Expect that maybe the true numbers
Slightly higher.
30% here will make a big difference.
Yes.
We'll go over 3 or something. Yeah.
Okay.
There
Yes.
was 1 more question.
Yes, from.
Two observations, not really questions, but there seems to be a very large gap between the time when the research started to come out and when the FDA decided to actually make laws regarding labeling. So
Yes.
from the research to implementation, it was a very long time.
Yeah,
And
yes.
then when they did implement changes, it was only regarding labeling and not outlawing the food or encouraging companies to make the changes. And now the companies are making their own changes and they're developing new technologies, but we don't really know if the new technology that they're developing is any better than the trans fatty acids. And
Sure.
so that research comes out will be another.
Sure. Yeah, that research will tell us whether we are moving from worse to better or to worse. Yeah. So the researches are still not yet there to tell us where we are moving to. Sure. Thank you.
Nearly, on the last
You know,
one.
I just didn't know if I missed something in what you said. Did you mention anything about 2015? Like the trans fat
that in the US that the FDA doesn't allow trans fat anymore?
2018.
2018,
No, no, 2015 is the law that passed.
is still
The law
the,
that passed in 2015 that the FDA
But it
requires
will be
all.
implanted in
And
the
I-
history
I
of
missed-
3 years. to implement.
they have
That's
3
why
years.
I didn't realize that I missed it.
What was really surprising is it seems that the industry is already is ready for it.
Mhm.
It seems that most of the products are already
Zero.
without trans fatty acid, and the question is, what will come next? What will be the next?
Hi everyone. Good afternoon. My topic is on alleviating food insecurity in Ethiopia. Is a food rescue and redistribution food bank is applicable in Ethiopia. So my deepest gratitude is to Mr. Evelyn Wisra for financing me to study here. And I would like to thank you, Dr. Aaron. He helps me a lot. Thank you so much for constructive idea and resolved support. This area is new for me as well as for my country. So without him, the completion of this paper would be very, very hard. So thank you so much. So Ethiopia is found in the eastern part of Africa, neighboring Sudan, Eritrea, Somalia, and Kenya. And it's the second highly popular, the population is very high. It's the second highly populous country next to Nigeria with more than 91 million people. There is 50 times as big as Israel. And life expectancy, 58 years for male and 62 for women. Poverty and food insecurity is a big problem in our country, and 35% of the total population is food insecure. Childhood stunting is 44%, underweight 29%, and childhood wasting is 10%. 23% of the total population is living under poverty line. Let me say something a little bit more on food insecurity in our country, Ethiopia. Food insecurity refers to a condition where people do not have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And it's determined by 4 main factors: lack of availability, lack of accessibility, poor utilization, and instability. Especially lack of availability and lack of accessibility is the main factor for food insecurity in our country, Ethiopia. Food insecurity, the statistics of food insecurity and its consequence show that 35% of the top population are severe food insecure, and 30% of household consume 3 or less than 3 food groups out of the 7 food groups per week, and 23% of population are below poverty line. 30% of population is below still food poverty line, which means unable to afford the minimum caloric intake for healthy and active life. 40% of population are food energy deficient, and 26% of the population consume less than acceptable diet. This is regarding awareness problem. 49% of the household expenditure is on food, which means more than half, 51% of expenditure on other, like or drinking, buying something like that other than food. So food insecurity affects also women. Nationally, 27% of women with age between 15 and 49 is underweight. And when we see by region, in Afar region is the highest, which accounts for 44% of the total women. Food insecurity also affects children under 5 years. Nationally, 44% of under 5 children is stunted. When we see by region, still Amhara, Afar, and Tigray region is the highest. And when we see again the wasting, and nationally 10% of the total children under 5 is still wasted, and Somali region is the highest, which accounts 22%. Again, when we see the underweight, at national level, 29% of children under 5 years are still underweight. And still Afar region is the highest, which accounts 40%. So this is a chronic problem. There is also emergency food insecurity. This year, Ethiopia faced one of the worst drought in history. At this time, more than almost 10.2 million people is affected, and it's expected to rise 15 million at the end of this year. The most affected area is Oromia and Amara, of course, highly populous area. So the cause of food insecurity, poverty. Poverty is the main. Poverty and food insecurity is go hand in hand. So poverty is the main factor for food insecurity. The other is climate condition. This is some specific area, and the main problem, the main factor for this one is around 85% of the top population living in the rural part of area, and then 90% of from the rural population is depend on rain-fed agriculture as the main source of livelihood. So if there is something wrong on rain, like if there is a rain failure, so the consecutive years will be very hard. For example, last year in 2015, there were a rain failure. Because of that, at this time there is very high problem food insecurity. More than 10 million people is affected. The other cause, infrastructure, education, government policy also. That is it. So what the solution? So my objective is to review the existing literature on food rescue model of alleviating food insecurity and explore its applicability to Ethiopia. Methodology, 60 articles were 60 articles were reviewed from searching from Google Scholars, PubMed. From this, 34 papers were excluded because of they are all redundancy, irrelevant, and partially missed data. 26 papers were included, which is irrelevant studies between 2010 and 2026, and the other 26, all 26 were reviewed for this paper. So what's food bank? Food bank is a charitable organization that collect and distribute donated food to needy people that would otherwise be wasted from farm, distributor, manufacturer, retailers. So food bank basically working by collecting surplus food and redistribute to needy pupils. To make more clear about food bank, let's see some challenges. There are some challenges in the world. There are basically two challenges. There are many challenges, of course, but regarding to this topic, there are two challenges. One is food insecurity. 700 million people do not have enough food to eat. From this, 60% of chronically hungry is women. And from the total days of children, under 5 children, 45% is because of poor nutrition. 1 in 4 of the world children are stunted. So surprisingly, 66 million primary school age children attend classes hungry across the developing world. From this, 23 million is in Africa. So there is one problem, food insecurity in one hand. In other hand, there is also food waste. This is also the challenge. Food waste, 1/3 of the food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. So the global volume of food wastage is estimated to 1.6 billion tons. From this one, the edible part is 1.3 billion tons, which is suitable for consumption. So food waste contributes twice as much as global warming as all the world air traffic. So it affects our environment. from FAO, you can see that here the food losses and wastage. In high-income countries, food is wasted starting from the initial agriculture production through to retailing and consumers. But in low-income countries, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia is found here, the waste of food at consumer level, at consumption level is very, very small. Mostly wasted at starting from initial production to all the process, retailing process. So this shows this also cereals. We can see in developed country, the waste is at consumption level as well as in production. But in sub-Saharan Africa, in general, in low-income countries, specifically in sub-Saharan Africa, the loss is very, very small at consumption level. So more during the production process. So this shows us the same is true for fruit and vegetable. So in general, this tells us if we can reserve waste food as production, we can provide food for needy people, and by this we can alleviate food insecurity. The consequence of food waste, it has negative impact on economy, social and environment. The loss of destroyed national products instead of being consumed in zero cost alternative as economic, and increase inequality as well as social disparities. So it has a negative effect on social, and it also negative impact on environment. Damage to the environment due to the need to clear excess, surplus, and increased production needs. So to minimize, to reduce the food recovery, there is food recovery hierarchy. This is to reduce the food waste, food losses at different tiers. The first two is the most preferred, the least one is least preferred. From this, the second is the best because it has benefit on economic, social, and environmental. Feeding hungry pupils. So now food bank serves as the link between food waste and hunger. There are millions of people do not have food in one hand, in the other there is waste food. So food bank link both between food waste and hunger. By this we can eliminate, alleviate food insecurity. How food bank works? Food bank works, as I said, it collects food from producers, manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, consumers, and distribute to needy people through NGOs, like charities, pantries, and others. There are more than 750 food banks in the world. All these food banks work together. This networking is networking of food banks. Global Food Banking Network is an international non-profit organization that fights world hunger by creating, supporting, and steering food banks around the world. So all are working together. This is the network of all food banks. As example, Feeding America, Lekat Israeli, Feeding America, food bank in America, Lekat Israeli, food bank in Israel, and all this is Federation of European Food Bank in Europe. But from all, Lekat Israel is the most successful and the best food bank, really. And it has some unique feature, of course, unique activities. Lekat Israel is founded in 2003 and is the largest food bank in Israel. It collects and redistributes fresh, perishable, quality food which would otherwise be considered waste from farms, hotels, military bases, and catering halls. So Lekat Israel has two unique food rescue activities. One is harvesting fresh products from farmer field. As example, last year they rescued more than 12,000 tons of agricultural products from 500 farmers last year. So it's a lot. And the second one is Israel has its own farm to grow specific agricultural products to provide sustainable variety of fruits, vegetables, and crops. These two things makes Israel unique from others. It's unique for Israel. All the other food bank doesn't have such these two, especially. They have, I mean, they can get the fresh vegetables by donation. I mean, the farmer will donate the fresh products like vegetables and others. In addition to this, Israel directly gather vegetables from farmer fields. So now the application of food bank in Ethiopia. As I told you, food bank is working by collecting surplus food and redistribute to people. So in our country, of course, we have manufacturing, hotels, supermarket, and others. We can collect surplus food and redistribute to people. But there are some concerns. The first, does this surplus food is enough in our country to feed hungry people? This is the first one, challenge. And the second one is about infrastructure. Is that suitable for the infrastructure of country is convenient for food bank, like transportation, communication, warehouse, transport, anything. It will be a very challenge for us. And the other is about product type. What product type are available for donations throughout the supply chain? I mean, finished product, dairy, vegetables, or others. What kind of? We don't know. And how the food manufacturing industry is structured. I mean, how the distribution of products is. I mean, to the higher market, supermarket, or shop, and how they handling this, the products. This is also a challenge for our countries. The last is what type of agriculture sector is available. Is that large corporate farmer or smallholder farmer? This also, all these things are very challenging for our countries for implementation in Africa. However, the application of Israeli model addresses some of the above questions. First, Israeli approaching of agriculture gleaning. Rescue fresh, nutritious food and vegetable from farmers is applicable to Ethiopia, where there is similar surplus and waste in farms throughout the whole year. So there is similar situation in our country, so we can collect and redistribute to Ethiopians. This answers some, especially surplus food, the issue of surplus food and the type of products. The second, Israel has its own farm of specific agriculture products to provide sustainable and consistent fruits, vegetables, and crop for needy people. This is also applicable for our country because since Ethiopia have arable land, it's a lot, it's a big country, and manpower, water, and others. So we have resources. So if we can manage and use the resources, we can implement the food bank by adopting Israel. The third is Israel gives awareness and public education on nutrition and its effects. This also could serve as a model for Ethiopian community to manage and use effectively and efficiently what's the available resources. Especially if you remember, I told you about 51% of household expenditure is expend on other things other than food. So if we just create awareness, they can expend more on food. So by doing this, food bank could change lives of people and change community by increasing food security. It's also availability and accessibility of variety safe food for communities that enable them to lead active and healthy life. It also creates jobs, empower individuals, and enhance their education and economic status. The limitation from the papers, all studies of food insecurity were conducted in very specific area, redundantly by using different study design. its limitation. The other is the sample size was very, very small. And most of the study used different food insecurity measurement tools. Some papers used food consumption scale as a comparison, the other one used household food insecurity scale. So it's not strong enough to compare with other the stats of food insecurity with other countries as a reference. Food losses and waste in Ethiopia were not covered in this review. So as a conclusion, the application of Lekets-Riley model of food rescue and redistribution is a major area of intervention for alleviating food insecurity in Ethiopia, particularly use of own farm and as well as gleaning of agriculture product from farms. The other is more for emergency food insecurity. So the importing of surplus food from foreign food bank can be one way of solution for tackling food insecurity. But even though it needs some infrastructures such as air transport, communication, warehouse. So if we manage these things, we can also import from the foreign food bank. This is more for emergency food insecurity. So thank you. That's all.
Okay, we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Guy?
Do you think this kind of intervention is feasible for African countries? Because like in Africa, most farmers are smallholder farmers, and usually they produce food that's not even enough for their families. They need them to buy more after purchasing. So do you think this is really feasible?
Yeah, for in our country it's feasible. Of course, there's some challenges, but as far as if you manage the challenges, it's feasible. I thought. Yeah.
Why is it that you have 10.2 million
People, yeah,
suffering from food insecurity?
yeah. At this time,
Yeah.
yeah,
Why?
yeah, because of last year in 2015, there were rain failure. Because of that, this problem is there. The main problem is 85% of the Ethiopian population live in rural part of country. This population is highly depend, almost 90% depend on rain feed agriculture. So if there is a rain failure, like this.
Just a question to ask. We understand that in Israel, that the surplus of food and some
Yeah.
people are just willing to give out the surplus that they have to the food bank. Now in this case, in Ethiopia, you're talking about security.
Yeah.
So where are you going to get the food to have this bank in the first place?
Yeah. That's why I'm just focusing on their own, yeah, for having own land, working like planting on agriculture. Let me back again.
You're talking 10 million people, here you're talking
Yeah.
a much smaller percentage.
Look, Lekets-Riley is the second one. Lekets-Riley has its own farm, a specific one. Yeah. Now, if the bank which is implemented in Ethiopia has its own land, the farm, it's possible to use this one, and as well as important for sustainability even. Yeah, I am focusing on the adoption of system from Lekets-Riley is mostly from own farm and as well as gleaning from agriculture farms.
Maybe I missed this, but are you targeting rural or urban? Who are more food insecure?
Almost the same, but mostly in rural part of the country. As a pilot, targeting on in main capital city as a pilot, for me as a pilot, because we have many hotels, many manufacturing, and many things. We can get easily surplus food. So as a pilot, targeting Addis Ababa, but and then nationally for next.
In the beginning, you said that the people, most of them eat only 3 groups of.
Less than 3, yeah.
Does it match to what it's been given? through the bank, what are the 3 groups that they eat, or what are the groups that they don't eat, that they miss? I'm asking if it matches what the bank, through the bank, they are getting.
I didn't understand. Yeah, they consume less than three or less than 3.
If you can show the
Yeah.
beginning, in the introduction, yes,
Yeah.
the second
Yeah.
row, you said it's less than 3, they consume less than 3 food groups. Which are the food groups that they don't consume? And does the
From
bank
this, okay.
supply it?
There's 7 food groups, yeah?
Yeah.
From the 7, 30% of households consume only 3. This shows the poverty, yeah? Because they couldn't afford to buy foods, enough food, so most 30% of households consume this food. Now, when we implement use food bank, we will provide for them and for others more food, more nutritious food.
Do you know the specific food groups that are lacking?
No.
But it's probably, help us, probably grains are probably one, and oil and sugar.
Okay.
Are probably the 3
Sugar,
groups.
what kind of
That's a
group is that?
scale developed by the World Food Program that they're using to establish this. It's a special scale for food insecure countries.
Sugar? A group called sugar?
They have 7 groups, and one of the groups is consumption of oil and consumption of sugar. And Nihal's using the same scale on the West Bank for her study. So probably those are the 3 groups that they're using, and so all the others are the ones that are missing.
Yeah, because he was talking about vegetables and
Fruits and meat.
Yeah.
And
Actually, the paper reported mostly starch food,
starch.
like yeah, that's why.
Arwen, if you have a last question, and we have to move on.
I think it's interesting that one of the challenges Garrett had was that there is a lack of specific information on food waste in Ethiopia. But if you go to the slide for a moment showing food waste around the world, both for industrial food and so this food waste per capita.
Yeah.
Can you bring up the slide?
Sorry. Yeah.
For a moment? So it's quite remarkable. The consumer doesn't waste a lot. So the individuals who have food, whatever food they have, they use. They're not throwing away food. And yet at the same time, it's a very large amount of food per capita, 150 kilograms, which is going to waste in sub-Saharan Africa generally. The next slide, you show that in fact in agriculture, these are cereals, and the same thing occurs in agriculture. In fact, in agriculture, it's more pronounced here. 20% of the food is lost in the processing, distribution, and post-harvest in agriculture. Within the agriculture, the next slide shows, again, sub-Saharan Africa, nearly half of the food is lost. That would probably relate both to small shareholders and also larger farms. So given that you have data which may or may not relate specifically to Ethiopia, but may be generalizable, it seems to be a pattern that occurs everywhere in the world, and I don't know why Ethiopia should be different. Given that you see this data, what would you target in order to rescue this few? What would you need to know, first of all? And what do you think the first steps would be in order to try to rescue some of this food and redistribute it to alleviate some of the need that exists in Ethiopia?
I mean, target population.
Does this give you any hint as to
Yeah,
where you might
definitely.
want to begin your work to try to identify food that's available that you could then use and redistribute?
Yeah, this could be a hint that most waste food is at production, starting agriculture production, starting the whole process. So if we can restore this food, we can minimize the food insecurity. So anyway, we need to work hard, especially food loss and wastage in our country. We don't have any data, but from this.
So what data would you like to collect? If you now had a
Food
grant for
losses,
the next year,
yeah.
what would you do going back?
Food
to
the wastage and food loss wastage in our country, one thing, and the surplus food, and how they manage and handling the surplus food. And this was into especially food loss and wastage. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
We're going to go on to our next talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pearl Anembabazi. I'm from Uganda. And before I start, I'd like to thank my mentor, Dr. Limoro, for her guidance in this work. I learned a lot working with you, and thank you very much. I'd also like to thank Peers Foundation for the scholarship that they gave me that enabled me to pursue this master's degree in this place. So, like I said, my topic is the body mass index paradox, but I'd first like to start by defining the word paradox. What is a paradox? Yeah, and the Webster Dictionary defines a paradox as a statement that seems to say two opposite things that may be true. Yeah, there's a possibility that it's actually true or it's not true. So in this case, the BMI paradox, we'll call it that, basically is saying that elevated BMI is better than lower BMI. Yeah. From background information, we know that overweight and obesity are associated with increased risk for disease. But in the BMI paradox, we are putting forward that being overweight is good. Yeah. So we want to analyze and see if this is actually true or if there's anything wrong with it. Yes. So at the moment, we consider that being overweight or being obese are related to increased risk for disease. But there was a time when being overweight or being fat was a good thing. It was considered a good thing. So yes, there's a medical aspect to health, but there's also a social aspect to it. In the prehistoric times, being overweight or fat was good, and as can be seen by that picture, the first is it's called the Venus of Willendorf, and it's a mother goddess. It was a goddess at that time in the Stone Age time, and women looked up to it. It's believed that it's a representation of a female figure at that time, that women looked like that. It was also, yes, the mother goddess, so it was associated with beauty and with fertility. Then moving on to the 19th century and early 20th century, still again, beauty was associated with well-rounded and full-figured women. Those were considered, you know, the affluent and the powerful and the prosperous and the beautiful women. However, in the 1960s, with the era of the fashion industry, now there was a change, a total change in the society, and we have met Twiggy before, yeah? And she was the first supermodel. Many young girls at the time in the 1960s looked up to her, and she was very skinny. Her name, Twiggy, was, you know, because of her size, just like a twig of a leaf. So we see society perception towards weight has changed over time. This is just from the society aspect. Then if we go to the medical point of view, being overweight and obese is associated with increased risk for disease, especially type 2 diabetes and heart disease and stroke. This was first shown after the Second World War. Data from the insurance industry at that time showed that there was people who were overweight or obese had increased risk for these diseases and therefore increased risk for death. They were dying more than people with lower weights. So the doctors at that time needed a practical, reliable index that they could use to measure relative weight. And yeah, before the BMI index, there was the Kotlet index, which was formed by this gentleman, Adolf Kotlet. And yeah, so this was formed in 1832, and it was later adopted as what we currently know as the BMI index by the World Health Organization in 1995. And we all know the formula, weights in kilograms divided by height in meters squared, and the classification, different ranges, with obesity, which is further classified in a dose-dependent manner. Yeah, so this has been in existence from 1995 up to today. This is what is currently used. Furthermore, obesity, yes, like I said at the beginning, it's associated with increased risk for diseases and mortality. It's currently it's second only to smoking as the cause of
preventable deaths, yeah, especially premature death, which are between ages 35 and 65. And according to WHO, 2.8 million people die of overweight and obesity-related deaths every year. So we have a big problem with overweight and obesity. But at the same time, now comes the paradox, which is saying that overweight and obesity is good, yeah? And this was first pointed out in chronic illnesses. The first was in chronic heart failure, heart diseases, where, as shown in the graph, on the y-axis, we have survival percentage and years following diagnosis of like the years of follow-up of the patients. And the yellow line, this one, is BMI less than 24.3, which is normal, in the normal range. Whereas the red line is 24.4 up to 34.1, which is up to like obesity grade 1. And the white line is BMI greater than 34.2, which is obesity grade 2 and above. But from this graph, we see that people with the lowest BMI have the lowest survival. And as BMI is increasing, they have better survival. And this is what is called the BMI paradox, yeah? So it was not only in heart diseases, but other diseases, chronic illnesses, went on to show that patients with overweight or obesity had better survival, like diabetes, like hemodialysis, and stroke. And the list, you know, still goes on and on. That is in illnesses, chronic illnesses. But also in the general population, these are healthy people who are not sick. There are studies that are showing that compared to the normal BMI range, people who are overweight, BMI 25 to 29.9, have better outcomes. Yeah? The overweight people have better outcomes than people who are normal weight. From the hazard ratios, we can see being overweight is associated with a protective effect against mortality. Yeah? So these studies are also reporting a BMI paradox in the general healthy population, people who are not sick. And the last study was a meta-analysis, which was done in 2013. It included over 97 studies and 3 million subjects. So it had a very big sample size. And it still reported a strong protective association of overweight compared to normal weight. So, yeah. We shall go a little bit into this paper, into details. They use standard BMI categories of WHO, which we have seen already. For the analysis, they had two broad age groups, one group of people older than 65 and another of mixed age categories, which was 25 to 65 years or 40 to 80 years. Then they adjusted for age and gender and smoking status, and they used both self-reported and measured BMI data. So our overall question that we seek to answer is, being overweight really healthy, like we have seen from the data before? The objective of this study was to analyze the data and see, is the BMI paradox valid? And the specific objectives, first is to examine the validity in the general population, people who are not sick. Then we want to see if it is not valid, are there methodological limitations that are contributing to it? That's for the general population. Then in the chronically ill people, is the BMI paradox valid in these people, or any other specific population that's reporting a BMI paradox, is it valid? If it is valid, are there any underlying mechanisms that are contributing to it? And lastly, from all the results we shall get, is there a need for us to revise the current BMI recommendations for any population that we have? Yeah, so the study involved searching engines such as PubMed and Google Scholar, using the keywords of BMI paradox, obesity paradox, yes, all-cause mortality, and the papers were then got using those keywords. Our results are going to be divided in 3 sections. We are looking at the BMI paradox in the general population, in chronic illnesses, and in the elderly. So we'll start with the general population. Our second objective was, are there any methodological limitations contributing to the BMI paradox? And we'll start with the second, and it will
give us answers to the first. This will help us answer if the BMI paradox is valid. So the first methodological limitation that has been identified is failure to exclude ever smokers. Evidence has been found that smokers usually have lower BMI than non-smokers, and therefore they have increased risk for morbidity and mortality, and they should be excluded completely from the analysis. We should have a category for ever smokers and never smokers, and not just current or former smokers, but there should be a distinction between those who have ever smoked and those who have never smoked. And this data from CDC shows that smoking contributes to more than 480,000 deaths in the US, which deaths arising from lung cancer or heart diseases or lung diseases or stroke, all because of smoking. Therefore, it's important for smokers to be eliminated from the analysis. Yeah. The second limitation that was identified in this study was failure to restrict for pre-existing illness. Yeah? It's been found that pre-existing illness results in reverse causation, which means that a low body weight is a result of an underlying illness and not the cause. Some diseases such as cancer, the patients have a weight loss for many years before the disease is actually diagnosed. Yeah? So the disease has caused the weight loss, not that someone fell sick because they had a low weight. Yeah? So this is the reverse causation. And therefore, to minimize bias, people who have pre-existing illness should also be restricted from studies which are measuring the association between BMI and mortality. The third limitation was short duration of follow-up. This is, yes, related to the previous limitation we just talked about. And it's found that if you fail to exclude patients that die within the first 5 years of follow-up, you'll include some patients who are dying from undiagnosed illnesses. Therefore, the first 5 years should be excluded so that you have more accurate results in your study. The last limitation is inclusion of a lower BMI range. Yeah, we're talking about BMI paradox. And the current normal BMI range is 18.5 to 24.9. But the lower end of the normal range, 18.5 to 19.9, usually contains frail elderly people and other people who are lean from people who have been sick for a long time and therefore they've wasted. Yeah? So these people within a BMI of 18.5 to 19.9 should also be excluded from this analysis. Yeah, so our 4 limitations are failure to exclude for smokers, failure to restrict for pre-existing illness, and failure to exclude people who died within less than 5 years of follow-up, and including people who had BMI between 18.5 and 19.9, the lower end of the normal range. So we want to look at, we've identified the limitations. We think this is what caused the paradox in the general population. And we want to see studies where they restricted for this. Was there any change in the results of their studies? Yeah. So there's a lot of controversy regarding BMI and mortality, the relationship between BMI and mortality. And recently, a global BMI mortality collaboration was formed. And it was established to provide valid estimates of the association between overweight and obesity with all-cause mortality across populations in all global regions. Most studies which analyze BMI and mortality are usually done in a particular country, like one country and one cohort of people. But this brought data from 4 different continents, from Asia, from Europe, from Australia, and from North America. Yeah, so their data is generalizable across the whole world. And they also conducted a meta-analysis, which brought about 239 prospective studies with very many patients. The age groups were 20 up to 90, and they had a long follow-up, more than 13 years. They adjusted for age, gender, and also the 4 limitations that we have identified. And their results in the, so this table shows the effects of successfully stricter precautions against bias on the analysis of BMI and all-cause mortality. In the first row, we see crude analysis with no exclusion. This is like in the meta-analysis, or the studies which report a BMI paradox. And as we can see, compared to the normal range, overweight is protective. The hazard ratio is less than 1. So it appears that it has a protective effect against all-cause mortality. So this is the BMI paradox. It would say that it's there. Even if you just excluded pre-existing illness, the paradox is still valid. If you excluded pre-existing illness and adjusted for smoking status, which is just current or former smokers, the paradox is still valid. But with stricter restrictions, if you exclude pre-existing illness and you exclude those who die in the first 5 years of follow-up, the paradox is lost. Like, overweight is no longer associated with a protective effect against mortality, but the lowest mortality is in the normal range. And even now, after restricting for all the 4 sources of bias, if you exclude those who die from pre-existing illness, if you exclude smokers and the first 5 years of follow-up, then again, the lowest mortality is in the normal BMI range, and overweight is associated with an increased risk for mortality. So there's no BMI paradox anymore. The other limitation was the lower end of the BMI range. And if we can see here, this is the lower end of the BMI range that we're talking about, 18.5 to less than 20, which is 19. The hazard ratio is 1.13. So these people are associated with a 13% increased risk for death. Whereas in the other BMI range, this is still the normal BMI range, 20 to 24.1, it's 1. It's the lowest, the minimum mortality. And overweight is 7, like there's a 7 increase in mortality, increased risk of mortality in the overweight range. So there's no paradox, again, after eliminating the lower end of the BMI, the lower end of the normal range. Another study, also a meta-analysis, in their first results, which included all participants without restrictions, everybody, they didn't restrict for anything. The lowest point of the curve, which is like the lowest mortality, was in BMI greater than 25, which is overweight. This is the overweight range. And this is a BMI paradox, true. But after they restricted for never smokers, the curve shifted. The bottom, they restricted for never smokers. The bottom part of the curve comes less than 25, which is out of the overweight range and back to the normal range. And so the BMI paradox vanishes again. So in summary, the ideal BMI for lowest mortality in the general population, if we are just restricting for never smokers, it's between 23 to 24 kilograms per meter squared. If it's healthy never smokers, this is after restricting for smokers and those with pre-existing illness, it's between 22 and 23. And if it's never smokers with longer durations of follow-up, this is after restricting those who die within the first 5 years of follow-up, it's between 20 to 22, yeah? So all these ranges are within the normal BMI range, the current WHO BMI range, which is, I'm pointing out that there's no BMI paradox, yeah? None of these values are greater than 24.9. None of them are overweight or obese. So our conclusion in the general population is there's no paradox, there's no BMI paradox, but the studies which are reporting a BMI paradox are biased by methodological limitations, and instead the ideal BMI is 21 to 24 kilograms per meter squared. So if we move on to studies in chronic illnesses reporting a BMI paradox, so this table summarizes results from some studies in specified illnesses. The first study was in atrial fibrillation. The second study was in myocardial infarction. And in the results section, again, overweight and obese. This time they did not specify if it's obesity grade 1 or 2 or 3, but still we see all of them have good positive results. It appears as if overweight and obesity have a protective effect against mortality. But on analysis of these studies, we found that they did not exclude any of the main methodologic limitations. Hence, these studies are biased. As we can clearly see, this first study had only follow-up of 3 years, so they couldn't afford to exclude for 5 years. It was a very short follow-up period. These other clinical illnesses who also did not exclude for the main methodologic limitations. This study also has 2.4, a very short follow-up period. And even this one, even though they had 9 years of follow-up, they did not exclude for those who died within the first 5 years of follow-up. Yeah. In addition, another source of bias that was found in these patients was most of these are, cardiovascular patients, and they're usually prescribed with cardiovascular medicines, which are protective, yeah, like the statins and the ACE inhibitors. So this gives them better survival compared to their counterparts in the normal range. Those were mainly cardiovascular diseases. And if we go to type 2 diabetes, the story is a little bit different, but still related. The first study was a meta-analysis by Chang in 2016. They didn't specify the age group, and they had a follow-up of 2.7 to 16 years. Again, they show that overweight had a protective effect against mortality. However, they did not restrict for any of the methodologic limitations that we talked about. The second study restricted for some of the limitations. They eliminated smokers, they eliminated pre-existing illness, but they did not exclude people who died within less than 5 years of follow-up. So their results are half-half. We can't really know if you should take them. Then the last study also, they still have a good BMI paradox with overweight being associated with positive association, but they did not exclude the lower end of the normal BMI range. Their classification was overweight compared to 18.5 up to 24.9, the whole normal BMI range that we have. Yeah, so one study in diabetes that excluded for all the sources of bias. They excluded smokers, they excluded those who died within the first 5 years, and they also excluded the lower end of the BMI, the normal BMI range. We see that the lowest hazard ratio of 1 is in 22.5 to 24.9, which is still the normal BMI range. And as BMI goes higher, this is 25.0 to 27, this is overweight going on to obesity. There's an increased risk for death, 14%, 27%, 34%. So higher BMI is associated with increased risk for death. There's no BMI paradox. So the conclusions for diabetes leave us, there's conflicting evidence, whereas in chronic illnesses such as atrial fibrillation, stroke, and heart failure, we would like to conclude that there's no paradox, but it's a source of bias. But in diabetes, there's conflicting evidence that is deserving of further study. So if we move on to the last population, which is the elderly, this study, which was done in 2005 on the association of the impact of age on the association between BMI and all-cause mortality. They found different results by gender. The BMI for women was slightly higher, BMI associated with minimum mortality. So for the hazard ratio of 1 for women was at 26.3, which is overweight, it's the overweight range, whereas for men was at 24.9, which is just at the border of the normal BMI range. This is for people 75 years and above. So it appears that there is a BMI paradox here in the elderly.
other studies also in the elderly which showed a BMI associated with minimum mortality. The first was by Roland in 2015. It was only in women, and it had 17 years of follow-up, and they excluded, for smokers, they excluded those who died within the first 5 years, and they found that the lowest BMI associated mortality was 27.3, which is close to 26 that we've seen in the earlier slide. And then the global BMI collaboration that we saw earlier, in their results for the elderly, the lowest, the BMI associated with minimum mortality for people older than 74 years, older than 70 years, was 24, which is still in the normal range, but it's elevated. It's higher than 21, it's higher than 22. So it's, you know, towards the overweight range. So we like to conclude that perhaps the BMI paradox might be valid for the elderly population. Yeah, so we've seen that, yes, maybe the BMI paradox is valid for the elderly, and we'd like to suggest some reasons why, what could be contributing to beneficial effect of elevated BMI in the elderly. And the first is changes in body composition with age. There's evidence that suggests that with aging, there's a decrease in muscle mass and an increase in fat mass. As you can see in this graph, the yellow represents body fats, whereas the blue is muscle. And this is the percentage body weight, and the x-axis is the age in years. So between 20 to 29, and this is the last group, 70 to 79 years of age. We can see that the blue, which is muscle mass, is decreasing as the years are increasing, whereas the body fat is increasing. Body fat mass is increasing. So it appears that in the elderly, there's an increase in body fat to replace the muscle mass or the lean mass that is being lost. But also, in addition, even though they are gaining fat, the literature showed that the elderly gain less visceral fat and more fat in the periphery, which is associated with less risk. And so they have less visceral fat, which is associated with increased risk, but more in the periphery. So it might be elevated weight or elevated BMI might be safe for them, might be protective for them. The second reason is that a low BMI would indicate poor nutrition status and therefore lack of essential nutrients, making one prone to sudden metabolic stress such as disease, which are common in the elderly. They could easily fall sick. Hence, it's safer for them to have a higher BMI because this would indicate increased metabolic reserves. So in case of a sudden illness, they would have like a fallback position, something to protect them. Yeah. So we've seen that BMI studies that are reporting a BMI paradox have limitations in their methodologies. Yeah. But that's like not the end of the story of the BMI paradox. BMI is, we widely use it to measure overweight and obesity, which are, overweight and obesity is like a measure of adiposity, like how much adiposity should you have. But BMI itself is flawed, like it has limitations, in its measure of adiposity. It's not perfect. It's not a perfect measure of adiposity. And one of its flaws is it does another limitation from these studies is they usually took one BMI measurement at the beginning of the study, like at baseline, and then they follow the people for 9 years or 10 years, but they don't take any other BMI measurement. So this first BMI measurement is not really representative of the person's weight for their whole life. So this is another limitation in the BMI story. And one study by Stokes and Preston tried to overcome this. And they had 2 BMI measurements. They took one BMI at the time of the survey, and they also had a value called maximum lifetime BMI, which they got by asking people what their maximum weight had ever been, excluding pregnancy. So using that maximum weight, they were able to calculate maximum BMI. And they categorized the people into 3 groups. They had an always normal group if the people
both at maximum BMI and at BMI of survey, they were in the normal BMI range. Or weight losers, if your maximum weight was lower than the weight at the time of the survey, or the BMI at the time of the survey. Or overweight or obese, if your BMI or weight was always in the overweight or obese range. And the results that followed showed that compared to people who were always normal, the weight losers, those who lost weight, were at an increased risk for death compared to those who were overweight or obese. So it was better, according to this study, it was better for people to always remain normal than to gain and lose or to be overweight. But it was better for them to stay in the normal BMI range. So another limitation of BMI is it's limited in its ability to limitation measuring adiposity. It fails to distinguish between fat mass and lean mass. It's possible, for BMI to categorize somebody who has a high muscle mass and someone with a high weight as both overweight, and yet these are associated with different risks. They have different health risks. And an example of this is, this picture shows two people who have the same BMI. Same BMI, which is normal, 22.3, and but they have different body fat composition. One has 9.1 and the other has 21.1. So if you're using only BMI, you would think they have the same risk. But if you use other measures of measuring fat, body fat percentage, you find that he is at a more increased risk than this other person. The last limitation of BMI is it doesn't measure fat location. If it is visceral fat, if it is subcutaneous, if it is in the periphery. And we know visceral fat is associated with an increased risk for diabetes and dyslipidemia and cardiovascular diseases. So one study that showed it took a combination of BMI and central obesity. And it showed that people who had a normal BMI, the normal range, but with central obesity, they had an increased risk for mortality compared to people who had only normal BMI without central obesity. And also, people who had a normal BMI and central obesity had a greater risk than those who were overweight without central obesity. So the aspect of central obesity or visceral fat is missing in studies that use only BMI alone. Therefore, in conclusion, we see that the BMI paradox is not valid in the general population because of the failure to exclude ever smokers, people with pre-existing illness, those who die with a short duration of follow-up, and those in the lower end of the normal BMI range, which is 18.5 to 19.9. It's also not valid in chronic illnesses such as stroke and myocardial infarction and atrial fibrillation. And however, there is conflicting evidence that deserves further study in type 2 diabetes. In the elderly, it might be valid because of the changes in body composition that happen with aging, where we have less visceral fat, even though we have increased fat. And BMI is limited in its ability to measure the total fat mass and the type of fat. So it's limited in its ability to measure adiposity. So these sources of bias, we believe, account for the BMI paradox and make it almost null and void, apart from the elderly. So our recommendation, basing on the review, is that perhaps there should be a revision of BMI categories for lowest mortality as follows: with all adults greater than 18, both male and female, from 18.5 to 24 to 21 to 24. So we're cutting out the lower end of the BMI range. And then for people older than 70 or the elderly, there'll be a difference between the male and the female, with the range slightly lower for the male and slightly higher for the female, with the male of 24 to 26 and the female 25 to 27 kilograms per meter squared. And lastly, Yeah, so perhaps the overweight is healthy for this population. It was a question that we asked earlier, that is being overweight healthy? So yes, maybe for a particular population, only people greater than 70. And yeah, so lastly, maybe there's a need to use waist circumference as well and other metabolic risk factors for more accurate definition of obesity instead of BMI alone. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we have time for 2 questions, that's all. And then we're going to move on, so if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask, very nice presentation, very provocative.
What do you do with smokers, actually? The smokers.
Pardon?
What do you do with smokers here? Actually, would they fit into the BMI paradox?
Yes.
So if you smoke, you're a little overweight, you're okay.
Probably.
Is that what you're saying? Isn't that really the BMI paradox?
Yes.
That should be, I think that should be the BMI paradox.
I think that's another aspect of the BMI paradox.
Because if you exclude or never smokers or whatever have you there, then that's one story. But apparently, if you try to extrapolate from your data,
yes, I think that would be another
you
paradox.
should have a cigarette, cigarette here and there, and be overweight.
Somehow I don't think that was Pearl's message, but okay.
Hidden message.
Hidden message.
But you know, it's true, because once they put the smoke, that changed the whole story. So actually we should work about not smoking for BMI. This is okay, so you see this changed, smoking, even ever smoking.
Right.
Last question from Ava.
No, just
A
based
comment?
on what we've discussed so far, what about like other factors that correlated with smoking? Like those people, they may have other certain lifestyle.
They might drink more alcohol,
And
they
they
might
may
play
social
sports.
more, they may be happier, and they may, I don't know.
For sure. Those who don't smoke and don't eat are
Are miserable.
definitely